Good afternoon, equity and education participants. My name is Dr. Nadrea Njoku, Assistant Vice President of the Frederick G. Patterson Research Institute. It is with great pleasure to welcome you to our final program of the series, reflecting on the past, present, and future of Black teachers in America's education system, a fireside chat with Dr. Dionne Danns. As you know, a professor's life is busy, so this is pre-recorded, right? Dionne Danns. So I'm going to start with an introduction for Dr. Danns, but I won't let the day go by with saying that I am one of Dr. Danns' former students, and her classes were always the most dynamic and engaging classes. She knew how to captivate an audience with history, so I'm excited to have her with us today. And Dionne Danns is a professor and historian of education in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has served as the department chair and associate vice provost for institutional diversity at Indiana University, Bloomington. A graduate of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, she began her career as an ARA-IES postdoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Danns has authored 3 books and most recently completed Crossing Segregated Boundaries, Remembering Chicago School Desegregation, which explores how graduates of the desegregated schools cross racial boundaries to integrate their schools. Dr. Danns, thank you for participating in our virtual learning series.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know we sent some questions your way. Remind me if there were any that in particular that rose up to the surface for you.
I think pretty much most of them did. So yeah, I'm ready to engage in most of the ones that you sent. Yeah.
Okay, great. So tell me, in what ways have Black teachers impacted Black education in America's K through 12 education system?
Well, I think the first thing we have to talk about when we talk about Black education or the history of Black education is that Black people saw education as a form of liberation and freedom. And so whether they were in the North or South, as soon as they came out of slavery, they were searching for education. So in the North, where Black folks began developing independent schools, once they came out of slavery after the Revolutionary War, Black people started traveling far distances, going to different areas to get schooling, whether it be from whites or from Blacks, or they started their own schools with a Black nationalist tint. So they were focused on liberation and being educated. And so those people that gained that first level of education then went on to become teachers. And so in the North, initially, for instance, in Boston, they had to rely on whites for funding after a while. And so once the public school systems were being created within the United States, Black folks in Boston who had been running an independent school asked the Boston School Committee for some of the funding. They're like, you started these schools, even though the schools are started and they were called common schools, and they were supposed to bring together people from different socioeconomic classes and all that. The reality was that they started out segregated. And so when Black folks asked for money to help with their schools, that led to white control. So then whites get to determine what's being taught and who the teachers are. So you end up with white teachers that care less about the children, that ended up in one of these independent schools in Boston. I think it was the Boston Free School. And so eventually Black folks had a choice between either having independent schools with Black teachers or segregated schools with Black teachers or self-segregated schools with Black teachers, or having integration. And so because people felt like if you're starting off as a new nation, why wouldn't you try to integrate? If you're supposed to be a part of the country, shouldn't you be integrated? And so in the state of Massachusetts, you had several cases being filed in the late 1840s around school desegregation. At the time, they would call it integration. And so in Boston, they lost the case, but the state of Massachusetts basically passed a law saying that schools could be integrated. So all that to say that Black folks in the North basically were like, we're about freedom. We want these schools, but we want control of our schools.
Sure.
But once you had whites, you got white funding, that meant white control. And so Black folks lost some of the control over those schools, which meant that there was less opportunities for Black teachers. In the South, Black folks during slavery and as soon as they came out of slavery, already starting schools. You know, we talked about this in our class,
Yes, we did.
looking at James Anderson's work. And so they started these schools. You know, it could be under a tree. Whoever knew how to read and write when they came out of slavery, they became teachers. And so, even though we give a lot of credit in the literature to the, Northern missionary associations like the American Missionary Association, we give credit to the Freedmen's Bureau for Education. Actually, one of the superintendents for the Freedmen's Bureau went around and he went around different states, rural, urban areas, and all he saw there were Black schools controlled by Black folks that were untouched by these organizations because Black people understood they needed to control their own schools. And that's why Black teachers became significant and important to the education. So the other thing that Black folks did in the South is, the South was behind in terms of in terms of public schools because of the slave system that they had. So once Black folks were elected to state legislatures, they and their Republican allies basically started um, uh, made sure that every state in the South had in the Constitution had education as a part of that. And so, with that necessity, if education is part of that, Black folks desire education, then Black people, Black teachers became fundamental in making sure that these schools happened. So that's how Black folks, basically helped to create the system of Black education for Black folks.
Yeah, they say we free, we want it. We've been waiting on it.
Yeah,
They didn't wait, actually. They didn't wait.
yeah.
Um, so I'm very, very familiar with Dr. Anderson's book. You taught it to us, we read it, etc. And there are so many connections between, the institutions that went about creating the teachers that became the teachers in the South and North, the United States abroad, broadly. There are connections between those normal schools and the historically Black colleges and universities that we engage with today. So can you tell us, how HBCUs played a role in the proliferation of Black teachers in America?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, especially in the South, Black folks didn't have many options for education. And so they had, Black people, Black folks, along with white folks, started historically Black colleges and universities. And so I think one of the interesting things is that for some places, you can get educated at high school level, but because there were so few Black high schools, Black colleges played a significant role, not just to educate college students, but they had lab schools to fill some of the gap. And they also had high school classes until people would just take those high school classes until they would end up in college classes if they needed. And so these schools were significant not just for educating teachers, which they certainly did, but they were also significant because they replaced high schools because there weren't enough Black high schools. So those schools became, without Black colleges, we would not have Black teachers
Mhm.
because they educated the vast majority of teachers that were teaching in the South. And so Black teachers became, Black colleges became important for educating that group of folks. I think the other important thing about Black colleges is that Black colleges valued Black people, even the ones that were run by white folks, and even the ones that may have initially started out with intention of keeping Black folks in their place. You
Mhm.
can't really, if you give people education, they're going to figure out how to use it for their own freedom. And so these colleges trained students to be excellent. They trained students to have a passion for working within the communities, and they gave students access to the best and brightest Black folks that were around. And so these schools played a significant role in making sure that the teaching core was filled within the South and as well as the North.
Mhm. That's really critical, to remember. I will say that being in Patterson the last 5 years, I have seen a shift um, in the public discourse, or when reporters ask us about HBCUs, they don't often ask that really silly question of like, do we still need these institutions,
Mhm.
right? I think we have established that we continue to need them. But when we think about their roots in the P through 20 pipeline, it's critical to keep that at the center of, education today and considering, just the history of it. Um, but I don't think we can have this conversation with talking about your critical work that you have done around desegregation in public schools. And you have often discussed the history of Chicago public schools in your work. I know you're a native of Chicago, correct?
The suburbs, but yeah,
The suburbs.
yeah.
In Chicago.
You know how folks are when they from Chicago, they're like, "You not from
Listen,
Chicago?" Yeah.
you from the Chi-Town. What role did you see Black teachers playing in the public education system of Chicago, the greater metro area?
Yeah. So when I was doing my master's thesis, I was like, I want to do something on Black teachers in Chicago, and I wasn't sure what I would find. And
Mm-hmm.
so the first project I did for my thesis was looking at Maudel Bousfield, who was the first Black principal in Chicago, and who I'm sure you're well aware of.
She is an AKA. Yes, she is.
Yes. So Bousfield, the North, as I mentioned, it was often difficult for teachers to get a job in the North. And part of that is because they only wanted Black teachers at Black schools. And so before the Great Migration of Blacks from the South to the North, you had schools that were relatively integrated, even though they may still try to stick most Black students at certain schools. The schools were integrated. They became segregated as more Black folks came, but the teachers were mostly white. And so because they would only allow Black teachers to teach at Black schools, that meant it was hard to get a job in the North. And so even though she had, a degree, she was the first Black student, first Black female student at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Even though she had all these credentials, she had teaching experience, it still took a minute for her to become hired. And so part of what they would do is give you not just an exam. They may give you an exam, a written exam, but they might also give you an oral exam to test whether or not you had a Southern dialect. So they found ways to keep Black teachers as substitutes longer before they were hired. And so she was hired as a math teacher in 1922. And then by 1927, she became a principal at Keith Elementary, and then also went on to another elementary school before becoming the principal at Wendell Phillips High School, which was a well-known Black high school in Chicago. And so she talks about her experiences having to, come in as a new principal, still have white teachers at the school, and them being insubordinate and trying to figure out how to deal with them. And so, she said within a year or two, most of the insubordinate teachers ended up leaving.
Sure.
She would talk about teachers in a room reading a newspaper and they're supposed to be teaching. Yeah. And so she had to figure out how to, get them to do their jobs or
Yeah.
leave. And so they left. And so she increased the arts at Wendell Phillips High School. She raised expectations for students, and she just provided a environment of excellence while at that school. So once I got to the University of Illinois to study, as a matter of fact, for Bousfield, I must say also that the University of Illinois in the last 10 years ago, I can't remember how long ago exactly, but they honored her with a new building in her name, a dorm in her name. So if you go to that campus, you will see that the dorm in her name. So just some honor to her being the first Black female to go to University of Illinois. Yeah. So I was glad my work just played a little role in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once I was trying to figure out what my dissertation was going to be, I ended up looking at the civil rights and Black power era. And so I was still interested in Black teachers, but I thought, oh, Black teachers are just going to be working outside the system and, involved in traditional civil rights organizations. But most of the work they did was about school reform. And so in the civil rights era, you had one teacher, Al Raby, who was he was a junior high teacher, but he ended up being a part of this is called the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations. And it was one of the major organizations in Chicago that led the civil rights movement. But they held these huge boycotts of the school when they were pushing for school integration. And so in 1963 and 1964, they boycotted in Chicago, but they also organized with other cities. So New York boycotted and other places also had these boycotts. And so he was part of that organizing group. So for him, it was, even though it was still related with schools, he was involved in larger organizing. And you had other teachers that were involved. You had teacher organizations that were run and Black folks participated in that were involved in trying to integrate the schools in Chicago. Once the Black Power era happened, and really not much desegregation happened. And so by the late 1960s, folks were like, forget desegregation. How about we just have control of our schools? We have our schools here. We don't have control. Whites make decisions about our schools. we want control. And so you had these around the nation in different parts of the country, particularly New York is best known for their community control efforts. And basically, you can have a formalized community control effort where you have the school board, the teachers union, as well. For New York was the Ford Foundation involved in an experimental district. And so it was at schools that were predominantly Black and Puerto Rican. And so Black teachers were fundamentally involved in making sure that school community control occurred. But what they found out is that they really didn't have control. So the moment they wanted to fire teachers, white teachers in particular, that they thought were not good teachers, then all of a sudden the New York teachers went on strike, and it became about teachers' rights as opposed to, community control. And so that experiment ended. In Chicago, Elizabeth Todd Breland talks about she talks about the similar community control efforts that occurred between the Chicago Board of Education, the Woodlawn Organization, which was a civil rights group, as well as the University of Chicago. Same thing happened. You have Black teachers and community members involved in trying to provide the best curriculum and the best teachers, but the moment you start firing white teachers, then you end up finding out you don't have much control. I look more closely at some of the independent work that happened at individual schools. So in Chicago, you had students organizing and boycotting school, asking for more homework, more Black teachers, more Black leaders, more homework. I don't know how often you have students asking for more homework, but they were like, we want more homework. But at Farragut High School, teachers led by his name at the time was Harold Charles, but he became Hannibal Afrique. They organized to create, they issued what they call the Black Manifesto. So everybody was issuing their manifestos.
Yes, manifestos are popular.
Yeah. All their demands about what they want and when they want it. And so they were arguing that they wanted Black school leadership. And one of the things that was interesting is they want Black contributions in every subject. And Afrique was a biology teacher. So he was like, I want this in science, I want it in math. And then they also wanted to have Black history course. And so they organized, and students were involved, community members were involved. And because the principal wasn't responsive, they said he had to go, and the superintendent let him go. And so they were allowed to run the school for 3 years with a nominal sort of principal. He was like a principal, but they were running it as community control for 3 years until an incident happened at the school, and they ended up having to give up that control. But it's just fascinating that time that Black teachers were really involved in organizing for community control. But then they were also involved in the unions. So they would be for and against the union. They're in the unions organizing for the unions to be more responsive. Some of them threatened to start their own unions, and in some places they did. You had teachers who they called them full-time basis substitutes. They were long-term substitutes that were organizing and forming their own strikes to try to get hired. And again, part of the reason they couldn't get hired is because they might have not been able to pass the written test or the oral test. And so they organized, they were able to get rid of the oral test. And eventually a lot of them were able to get hired once they changed the qualifications for the exam. And so you also had Black teachers. At one point, the union, Chicago Teachers Union, decided they wanted to strike, and Black teachers was like, no, we're not striking. So they held Black schools open. And they basically told the newspapers, like, we don't need more pay. What we need is for you to take this money and fix our schools. And so Black teachers were very instrumental in trying to reform education in the city of Chicago. But it's, that's what I study, but we see this happening across the country.
Yeah. I think that there are threads of that in Louisiana as well, where I grew up, all around the country, where I think Black teachers and the Black community at large is always the group that helps to center what's important, right?
Yes.
What's the critical priority to get, closer to what we really need as a community. We touched on HBCUs a little earlier in the conversation, and I'm curious, it makes me wonder what, as a historian of Black teachers, if you went to college wanting to be a teacher, or if that was in any part of your aspiration, because I'm also curious if you can give us some thoughts on what you know, because HBCUs in an upcoming report, Hard Work for Hard Work, we talk about the HBCU as a critical lever in Black teacher preparation,
Mhm.
right? And so we're curious from your perspective, what inspires prospective teachers to be teachers, and if that is in any way connected to your own personal story.
Yeah, I guess I can start with my personal story, and you can remind me if I forget to answer the other part. But
Okay.
I think initially I wasn't sure what I wanted to be, and then I thought about it going maybe sophomore year. Between sophomore and junior year, I taken a year off, and I thought, well, maybe I want to be a teacher. But I was also doing temp work, and I was like, oh boy, I can't do 9 to 5. I was like, this is not gonna work for me. So I decided I wanted to be a teacher, and I figured I would go into history. So my father has a PhD, but I didn't grow up with him.
Mhm.
But he sent me a copy of his degree. So in the back of my mind, I always thought that at some point I would get a PhD.
Yeah.
So I'm in the teaching program. My senior year, they tell me to go visit my old high school.
Mhm.
And I was scheduled to student teach in Macomb, Illinois, which I went to Western Illinois University. Macomb, Illinois is in the middle of nowhere.
Mhm.
And I remember even as I was observing in a class in a school, I walked into school and everybody's head turned. And when I got to the classroom, I said, I'm the only Black person in this building, right? And the
Mhm.
teacher said, yes. And so I was like, when I went to visit my old high school over spring break, somehow I was thinking about this recently. I was like, it was my former coach, was at the time the principal. I think he took me to some of the most challenging classes. And I was just like, there's no way I'm going to be prepared to do that if I'm scheduled to student teach in Macomb, Illinois.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And so I had to think quickly because I was like, maybe I should just go get this PhD now. And so because I was still interested in education, and then as I was doing my master's and was fortunate enough to apply in time to get funding and all that, then one of my advisors told me about the program at Illinois where I can learn history of education or study history of education, which
Mhm.
brings together both of my passions. And so, yeah, I wanted to do it. And perhaps if I had chosen to student teach around where I grew up, it might have been a
Yeah.
little. So my sister actually went on to become a teacher, and she's still a teacher.
Mhm.
And she ended up teaching at our old high school and our old junior
Mhm.
high.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, she student taught in the area. So,
Yeah. I mean, my mother was a public school teacher and taught up until Katrina in New Orleans. She became a teacher primarily because of her own learning stories, right? Like having really bad teachers in public school and thinking I could do better. But for her, and I will stand a testament to it, becoming a teacher was such a, a shift to a steady paycheck
yeah.
and a life that allowed her to be a mother as well
Hmm.
as a professional. You know, you get off at a certain time, you
Hmm.
have 10-month contracts, so you spend your summers with your children. They allow a workforce to be very family oriented in some aspects. And it was a vehicle into working middle class life for us that we didn't
Hmm.
prior
Yeah.
to. Now, it certainly is one of those professions that has a heavy burnout factor, right?
Hmm.
But I think we all use those moments. I also wanted to be a teacher and had a student teacher experience. I actually my first student teaching experience was in a students a line student classroom, and it was students who were mainstreamed into public school but were blind. And I mean, you
Hmm.
have those experiential experiences help shape and make you make decisions about where you should be and where you might not be as successful in integrating. But it's amazing to hear your story and then connect that to your own scholarship, you know?
I think what was interesting too is that I realized, so I still, when I was in graduate school, I was involved in a lot of organizing. So I worked in after school programs, in school pullout programs. And so one of the things I learned is that I probably would have been great at second grade. So working with them in
Second
day
grade
camps
is
and stuff.
different. Hmm.
Yeah, I realized I was like, oh, I could have been a second grade teacher. I really that was a good age for me. I could do high school. I'm better with when I voluntarily coach track and things after school activities. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean when I speak to teachers whom are I count as some of my best friends, there is there's that sweet spot. Like some say I love the little ones, some say I can only be a high school teacher, etc. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, has your work, your historical and archival work ever pointed to some of the inspirations or even your activist work pointing to why people go on to be teachers?
Yeah, I could. So I think I'm even thinking more recently about one of my students is doing a dissertation on teachers in New York and how, what their motivations are for teaching. And a lot of them basically said that they had teachers that inspired them. So especially if they've had a Black teacher, because a lot of these teachers see them beyond just the academics. And while it's not that just because I see you beyond academics and I'm able to help you out with different situations you're in, doesn't mean I'm not pushing you towards excellence. So they found those teachers that balanced those things, that respected their parents, that, had a curriculum that was responsive to the needs of students. And so those excellent teachers often inspired them to be teachers. So it's interesting that your mother's situation was different. And so people have different motivations. Some people, they're like, oh, it's only 10 months, as you mentioned. So it works well for family. Other folks like, I just need a vacation. I want the whole summer off. For a lot of students, it's a calling. And so they sort of see it as a way to make changes within the society. And so that's why they get involved in these schools. And so particularly if you're going to HBCU, you're in a place where you're nurtured and supported. You're around excellent teachers, you're around excellent Black folks all the time. And so and you're also taught to sort of give service to the community. And so teaching is one of the best ways to do that. And so people are initially called to do this work. Some people end up in it, but other folks are called to do it. And so I think part of that is trying to figure out how do we talk to students about, going into teaching. For your mother, it helped get you all into the middle class, but now people are thinking it's not enough pay for the types of stuff they want to do. So
Yeah.
how do we focus on what it is that teachers do and not as much on pay is certainly important, and I would not negate that, right? But how do we focus on the fact that being a teacher means that you can influence students to transform the world?
Yes, I agree. And that, leads into the idea of what types of policies and initiatives need to be made to assist in recruitment of Black teachers. Do you have any insight on that? I mean, we talk about pay, right? We
Pay is
always
definitely.
quote, we always quote that teachers are the least paid, but have the biggest job, you know?
Yeah, I think really teachers, there are a couple of things that can happen. Number one, if we're looking at the federal and state policies and local initiatives, um, in the last 20 something years, there's almost been like a backlash against teachers, and teachers are being blamed for everything that supposedly is going wrong in the public schools. And so there have been a lot of neoliberal policies, and neoliberalism basically means the privatizing of public functions.
Mm,
And in these policies, they're also denigrating teachers' unions and denigrating teachers, and also trying to destroy public schools in the way we know it. So every generation since the start of the common schools have been working to perfect public schools, but this is the first era we're in where we're seeing more and more public dollars being siphoned off to charter schools. And even though charter schools are public, they're privately run or
mm,
being siphoned off into voucher programs where people are given per pupil expenditure to go to different schools. And so if we can stop these neoliberal policies from occurring, then I think we can recruit more students because it'll be a better environment. So in their push for what they call, in the video, waiting for Superman, they see charter schools as this Superman, like it's going to solve all the problems in the society. But the charter schools don't perform any better than public schools. We have
mm,
excellent charter schools. We have excellent traditional public schools. We
mhm,
have terrible charter schools. We have terrible public schools. But what it does do is siphon the money away from traditional public schools. And
mhm,
what often happens is you can be in a charter school where they're sometimes more restrictive. Everybody comes to a public school, But if you're in a charter school and you don't follow their rules, they may kick you out, but they may wait to kick you out until after they have the state expenditures. And so
Mhm.
now you're going back to the public schools without that money. And
Mhm.
so it's one way that they're just siphoning money away from traditional public schools. The other thing is we've had too much of an over reliance on testing. So
Mhm.
standardized testing was just like everything. I'm like, standardized testing tests your parents' income. It tests what you've been exposed to. It does not test your intelligence. And
Mhm.
so, they've had a number of accountability policies in place. One, teachers' pay sometimes are determined by their students' test scores. You have schools the teachers being kicked out, the leadership being kicked out, schools being closed down or reconstituted because the schools aren't doing well. So we were in an era in the last 20 years where instead of supporting schools that need the most help, we were punishing them. So we're over
Mhm.
here all about not leaving any children behind, but we were still leaving this very children behind that we claimed that we were going to try to save. So getting rid of those types of policies, I think that's number one. And we already talked about raising teachers' pay and the conditions for teachers. But in this era, we talked about they were negatively talking about teachers and teachers' unions. So we need to stop that. Teachers need to be treated as professionals. They
Mhm.
need to be given an opportunity to improve. Not everybody is perfect in their first year. So they need to be given incentive to improve. They need to be given professional development to improve. Teachers need to work with each other and not be in an environment where they're competing against each other for pay based on student test scores. So they need to be working in teams. Um, and we need to have funding because teachers are doing everything. They've always done everything, but they're also counseling students. They're providing students that don't have things that they need. And so if we can provide more of the funding that we need for students to be more well-rounded or to meet all of their needs, it would be helpful so that that doesn't fall on teachers. So during the pandemic, they had, they would keep the schools open, give students food. If they, had food insecurities, they'd be able to eat. So trying to figure out how do we not just support teachers, but support schools and students so that students can actually focus on learning and
Mhm.
not focus on all these additional problems. And so, in terms of treating teachers like professionals, it seems like everybody who's gone to school think they have a solution to schools. So I remember when I was at IU, I would get students that would come see me and they wanted to get into educational policy. And I was like, well, what do you know about education besides the fact that you went to school? Like,
Mhm.
are you a teacher? Have you planned on, are you going to try to teach first to see what the problems are? But everybody thinks they have a solution to the problem, especially politicians. And so they're making decisions about schools that have nothing to do with teacher input. And now we have, banning on discussion of race, banning books. And so we're in an era where we're having all this discussion about free speech, but we're not giving teachers who are professional, who are able to have these discussions when they do, because they don't really do it. Because I'm teaching college students and I'm asking them what they learned about race, and they're like, I've never heard of any of this stuff. And so we're erasing the little that we already had. Now, certainly there are some excellent teachers that, taught Black history, taught these different histories, but any teacher that's trying to do teach any of these types of histories in places like Florida, and Texas and other places, they passed all these bills that are making it more difficult for teachers to be able to teach the truth. So
Yes.
free speech, but free speech for who?
Mhm.
So why is it that parents now know more about the curriculum than teachers and they haven't been trained?
Mhm.
Why is
Mhm.
it that some person that got elected to school board knows more about what needs to happen in classrooms than teachers?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
if we can give teachers back the power that they've always had, I think that would make it, along with the pay that they need, I think that would help us recruit more
Yeah.
teachers.
Yeah. Yeah. I certainly am. I can't imagine a profession where you would go into it and someone else tells you what to do and you would feel like you feel motivated to stay. Right. And we talk about this a lot in the HBCU context, within Patterson and also within our Institute for Capacity Building, making sure that we have people on the ground who have the expertise and experience that can inform the practices we're advocating for, you
Yeah,
know? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think we do it worse with teaching. I'm like, every profession has rules, but part of the reason why they get away with it in education is because it's such a feminized occupation.
Mm,
And so because it's women, they act like they don't have expertise. They don't do this to firefighters. They
Mhm.
don't do this to doctors and lawyers. And so that's part of the issue too, is that there's a lack of respect for the profession because it's heavily, you know, run by women.
Right. Hmm. Yes, in the series that we had this week, there is a highlight of a research report that looks at Black male teachers and their impact in the classroom, particularly those that attended HBCUs. And they
Mm-hmm.
found that they're taking all of the good things, all of the gems from HBCUs and putting it in their classroom. My brother-in-law is a public school teacher in Georgia, and he went to Albany State, trained there. He's a fantastic math teacher. And, we take all the good things that we experience and bring them to where we work,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Is there anything, I know, I thought a lot about the conditions of archives when we're thinking about the history of teachers and how they're documented. I can imagine, your work benefits from good records. Is there anything in the archives that we're aware of that we can improve upon as we document Black males in the classroom?
Um, I'm not sure. I can't necessarily speak to just Black males, but I
Yeah.
know like Jarvis Givens has he's at Harvard, and he has they're doing Black Teacher Archive right now, and they're digitizing it. And so I think that will probably get at some of that. And so, he's worked with Vanessa Siddle Walker, and I forgot, he's also associated with another scholar, well-known scholar at Harvard. And so they have this Black Teacher Archive where they're getting all the records on this Black teacher organizations that existed. And so they're putting that together so it can be made publicly available. And
Yeah.
so I think that is one place. So part of it, the hope is that he and Vanessa Siddle Walker talked on a panel at the History of Education conference about the importance of that, using that archive. But
Mhm.
Dr. Walker was like, you also need to know the larger context. So don't just go in
Oh
these
yeah, don't
archives.
go up. Please
Yeah,
don't walk up on her without
yeah, don't,
context.
exactly. So she was just wanted to make sure that people understood the context because, she spent her career writing about educational leaders and how they're being connected to each other. And, they were the ones that helped to push to overturn Jim Crow. They're the ones that influenced the NAACP with the school desegregation. They're the ones who put their livelihood on the line to join organizations like the NAACP to be a part of teacher equalization cases. And so, yeah, the Black teachers have done a ton, and the records are there, and folks are working to try to make sure it's more accessible.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And then I think one of the interesting things I think we learned from Vanessa Siddle Walker's work is that, when she was doing her last book on the lost education of Horace Tate, one of
Yes.
the things she talks about, having to, going and interviewing him and then going several times, and he just the way in which as he began to gain, she gained trust with him, how he kept opening more and more archives to her. And he collected so much information
Mm.
from the teachers organization in Georgia that he was a part of, that information is now being digitized. And part of what I guess I'm saying is that we may not always get the stuff on the archives, but what I also advocate for is oral history. And
Yes.
so we have a lot of scholars that have done, especially when people talk negatively about Black schools in the South, that through the use of oral history, and they may call it different things, but interviewing people about what their experiences were like as teachers, I think that helps. And so part of what we need to do is making sure that we're keeping records or interviewing people or making sure that folks are aware that the things that they're doing matter. And so, and if we don't leave records about the work that we're doing, then it gets lost in history. And so, again, part of that is we may find it by interviewing people and find that they have documents in their basement or what have you. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we know, I think researchers at the intersection of, the practice of research in the margins fully understand that you're not going to get anything without the building of a relationship,
mhm,
right? So when we do work in the field, our the trust that we have or we end up establishing a deeper sense of trust is key to what we have access to, or even be able to access that institution, right?
Yeah.
And I think people of color at any marginal intersection understand that everyone seeking information is to not be trusted, can't be trusted. You know, the deeper you lean into the human relationship, the more you get, especially around archives. And it's particularly important, as you pointed out, to preserve the walk of Black teachers historically. You know, the history of historically Black colleges and universities, their archives need support and supplementation. And it is going to be particularly important in the new frontier in trying to expand the access of Black teachers to be able to map what happened prior to their arrival.
And I think that because we don't consider, I remember when I was moving from Bloomington to Chicago, and I was having a conversation with Eddie Cole because I had gone through all of my files, and I was just like, I dumped them, and he was like, "How you gonna?" I went through them. I went through them, and I was like, "Oh, this is a fascinating history and recycle." And so he was like, "Don't you want, don't you want somebody to tell your story?" I was like, "I don't want anybody telling my story." That's terrible as a historian to say, but
well, no, you're adamant that like your older writings aren't necessarily your best writings.
Well, it's not, it wasn't even my writings.
Oh,
It
it
was
wasn't
just,
your writing?
it was like the organizations I was involved in
Oh,
college. Like
yeah.
I
I got you.
had stuff from when I was an undergrad. Like I'm just a pack rat.
Yeah, well, he'll take old books. Eddie will take any good old book.
It
I'm not
wasn't
sure
even books. It was
story.
just that. It was just like my journey in a sense, right? And so I'm bringing this
I have
up
to
to
agree with
say,
Eddie.
yes, I'm bringing this up to say that if you have those documents, you may think it's insignificant, but an archive may want it.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. And so trying to figure out where's the best place to put these, because one of the things I'm trying to teach my students is that your family, your life is part of history. And so I have them doing educational autobiographies for their assignments so that they can interview their parents and grandparents. And since I'm at UIC, a lot of the students are first generation college students, but they're also, a lot of them are immigrants. And so they come in and just fascinating because it's the first time they've asked their parents or grandparents about their histories. And so I'm trying to find a way to get people to preserve their histories by interviewing people, having people interview their own families. And I think that's another way to sort of figure out or get at what are these histories. And I think the bigger issue is once you do the interviews, where are we putting the histories so that they can be preserved? And even if it isn't for an archive, how could it be preserved for your grandchildren or your great grandchildren?
Yeah, I agree. So everybody watching, because there are teachers, students, etc. If you have a grandmother, grandfather, aunt, uncle who was a teacher, please don't let their stuff sit in a wet basement.
Yeah. And once they pass away, don't just toss it.
Right.
I think that's the thing. So yeah. So part of it is that the family, because it's overwhelming when people pass away and we collect so much stuff. And so part of it is go through them, take your time if you have the time and go through the materials, and just, you can ask almost any library, any HBCU or any sort of place that holds records, whether they'd be interested in those records.
In holding records, absolutely. Well, we only have a few minutes left. We had a very efficient conversation. So I walked through all my questions, but I wanted to give you some time to share with the audience anything you think is important when we're considering Black teachers that you might have not talked about.
Yeah, I think probably talking about Black teachers in the civil rights era.
Yes.
And so I think, yeah, how they inspired students in the civil rights era. I think part of what occurred is that, once schools we had two questions we didn't talk about. We also didn't talk about,
this is my old teacher, everybody. She's gonna keep me accountable.
We didn't talk about the loss of teachers. What happened to the loss of teachers?
Yes, well, I mean, okay, so let me package this then. I'm always cognizant that we operate on these anecdotal ideas that like teachers are decreasing, right? Well, can you tell us that is correct? They are. and then, some of the reasons why. And then we can end with the significance of the civil rights movement and public school teachers.
Okay. So yeah, so school desegregation was probably the biggest reason that we had a loss in Black teachers. And even though Black teachers pushed for school desegregation, and it's often said that they didn't want it, you had lots of Black teachers that were pushing for it. And as I mentioned before, Vanessa Siddle Walker's book on Horace Tate actually talks about the fact that the strategy came from teachers and came from teacher organization and Black educational leaders for school desegregation. So Black teachers were interested in desegregation. However, once desegregation finally occurred, more than 15 years after Brown in most places in the South became the most desegregated, but then they fired tens of thousands of teachers. I've heard numbers between 30 and 40,000. I think I heard recently somebody said 100,000 teachers. Wow. I don't know the exact numbers, but tens of thousands of teachers were fired. Black principals were demoted, and that was the first devastation of the teaching corps. And so some of the teachers, tried to go north, but as I mentioned, there were a lot of restrictions on teachers becoming or people becoming teachers in the north. For teachers who stayed and ended up at desegregated schools, then they sort of face a second-class citizenship within the schools. Sure. They're even, despite their years of experience, their higher level credentials, because oftentimes, Black teachers had master's degrees, additional training. In spite of all of that, they were still treated like they were not good teachers. And so they had to face discrimination from their peers, from students, from parents, from the principals. And so they basically were facing racial battle fatigue and had to figure out how to operate. Now, of course, we always overcome. And so they were able to
small
do it.
superpower. Just a small superpower.
Just a small one. So they were able to, figure out how to operate in those systems, but eventually the schools became segregated again. And so that was the first loss. The second one has been this contemporary school reform. Yeah. And so, you talked about New Orleans. New Orleans ended up shutting down their public schools after Katrina, getting rid of the Black teachers and then hiring white teachers from Teach NOLA, which is similar to Teach for America. And so that got rid of Black teachers in New Orleans, but they were doing it in other places. And similarly in Chicago, they closed down all these Black schools, but then opened up charter schools or contract schools. And that meant that Black teachers lost their job because a lot of these charter schools, in order to keep the cost down, they like to hire new teachers and they like folks from Teach for America because new teachers, you don't have to pay them as much. They also are anti-union in a lot of these schools. And so that meant also a reduction in the amount of Black teachers, because if you close down a bunch of Black schools, Black teachers are going to lose their jobs. And so those are the two big time areas where we lost a lot of Black teachers.
Yeah. And then finally, let's just end it with the significance of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. I think one of the things I remember when I was trying to, doing organizational work or organizing work when I was in grad school, I remember thinking, oh, and every organizer think, oh, they was just waiting for me to come along. Or my group to come along and we're going to solve these problems. And you realize after years and then you get burnt out like, oh, okay, this is not a sprint.
No, this is a marathon.
Yeah. And so one of the things that occurred is that Black teachers always train their students for what was beyond, for the world beyond what they could see. And so they often train them to exist in a world that was not there. So they focused on democracy. They focused on showing inspiring Black children by teaching them about Black history. You had Carter G. Woodson, who started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And he wrote several books, started a journal, Negro History Bulletin as well. And he basically believed that if people knew the true history of Black folks, we can end racism. And so his purpose in life, and it was almost like a mission for him, was to make sure that he provided the materials necessary for teachers to be able to teach Black history. So he was organizing he was in touch with folks all over the country, teachers all over the country. And so Black teachers would secretly hide the materials. They may have his book that they're reading from on their lap, which Jarvis Gibbons writes about, and then they have the regular textbook on the table in case a white visitor or the superintendent comes by, because you could be fired for not teaching the curriculum or trying to inspire Black folks above their station. And so Black teachers found ways to have culturally relevant pedagogy to try to inspire their students. And so year after year after year, even if some generations couldn't necessarily push once the civil rights era came, even if it seemed spontaneous, people were prepared because they had been taught by Black teachers on how to build a new world, bring a new world into existence. And so Black teachers, even if they didn't participate in a march or what have you, they were back there giving financial support, giving students strategies, and working to make sure that the movement was successful. And so Black teachers have always been a part of that. So one of the things I think, I was on a panel and we were talking about one of the cases for the Supreme Court cases on school desegregation. And I remember we finished the discussion and it was kind of depressing. And then I remembered what Vanessa Siddle Walker talked about. I was like, so part of it is we assume that we need to have all the answers to solve the world's problem. But the reality is, if you're a teacher, and particularly for Black teachers, if you teach critical thinking, if you support the children, we don't know who's going to solve the problems, but if you give them the tools, then they can solve the problems. And so part of what I think in inspiring or trying to get students to think about teaching is that it is the one job where you get to help students develop to, as Vanessa Siddle Walker says, to their highest potential. It's the one job where you don't have control necessarily over what happens, but you provide the materials and watch the children grow. And so I think that is, if nothing else, I would like to leave with that it's probably one of the best and most rewarding jobs you could have.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely see that. That you're in the driver's seat for the future when you're teaching. Well, I certainly want to close with thanking you. I want to thank you for being a panelist, but I also just want to thank you for being, a consistent thought partner to me. And as assistant vice president here at UNCF and leading the research agenda at UNCF, I don't think I could be as great as I am if it were not for my teachers, and you were certainly one of those. Eddie, myself, Mahogany, we never miss a moment to talk about how great your class was. So we appreciate you. And we want to thank everyone else who is tuned in today to hear my conversation with Dr. Danns. We want to thank you for your participation and joining us for the whole week. And you all will receive a survey in the future for feedback for future FDPRI events. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Danns.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.